On the morning of July 1st, I logged on to the utter delight of a letter from my in-game mama. I barely read the letter in a haste to see the present within. Why, yes. Oh my, it was a mom's plushie. Upon throwing it to the ground, I discovered the cutest item to ever grace all Animal Crossing games combined. He's so cute. And it was time to see if it got any cuter. When seeing my other options, I knew I had to obtain this item IRL. But that left me with the question of which one. And my answer was... make them all! I started my quest with fabric, the skin of any plush baby. For most of the plushies, I chose flannel because it has this homemadeness about it, and it's just nice to cuddle with. However, in-game, I think most of them were not made of flannel. Bedford, I would say, was flannel. As for Puppers, I think he's probably a fleece, maybe a flannel. Pippa, Dot, and Gertie seem to be made of some sort of heavy-duty cotton, like the kind of stuff you would use for upholstery, but I'm not sure. Dot could also be a linen. When it came to choosing Gertie's fabric, she is basically the embodiment of that classical phrase, you do you. So I took that to heart and I did me and went with this super cute bunny fabric, which I love. For Dot, I really also wanted to do a flannel, but the only thing I could find that was yellow with white polka dots was in a calico cotton, so that's what I went with. And for Roary, he has a special place in my heart because he's clearly this patchwork dog made of like denim and some sort of like other cotton fabric. So I'm making it out of this dress, which is very special to me. It was one of my go-to dresses for like 3 years. And a couple years back, the elastic started to give out, so I haven't worn it as much lately. And I think this is the perfect opportunity to make it into something I can love and cherish. Plus, the dress is made of like a denim material along with a cotton floral, which is just absolutely perfect. Time to get our scribble on with invisible ink, of course. Out of our main fabric, I'm going to be cutting the head and back. Seeing that these cute little doggies are completely symmetrical down the center of their face, we will need 2 pieces of each pattern of fabric. And really make sure to flip it each time you copy the pattern because I slid a couple times and one of them will be wrong. You can find this pattern in the description below, although I will mention it's not perfect because I made it and I kind of know what I'm doing, but I've never like professionally like made or sold a pattern before, but it's free, so, and it's better than nothing. So there's a pattern for you. Let's chop to it! I'm going to be sewing my plushies on the machine since I have 6 to do and not enough time to do them all. So as I'm cutting, I'm giving myself about 1/4 inch of seam allowance. However, if you have the time, I highly recommend sewing them by hand. It's something you can take and do anywhere, and I feel like it just comes from the heart more when it's handmade. So if you're hand making it, just cut about 1 centimeter of seam allowance. When all is cut, the pairs will be yearning to be with each other. So it's best to match them up, and of course you're going to match them up with the right sides on the inside. So when you sew, the seams will be on the wrong side, and then you can flip it out to the right side, which you probably already know this, so I don't know why I'm telling you. And if you would like, now is also the time to pin. I am so lazy that I didn't do that. But you are more than welcome to. Now, to tie the pieces together in hundreds of places with a little thread. Sometimes people call this sewing. As we sew along the straighter parts of the chest, stomach, and back pieces, we are actually creating that seam that runs all around the center of our little friends, which I would argue this seam is a characteristic as important as the dog's noses. This is because the seam basically screams that the plushie was homemade. As a person literate in plushie design, such as those who would be designing a store-bought plushie, would not put a seam literally smack dab down the middle of the dog's face. So this seam, in all its wrongness, is so incredibly endearing, and it really brings a certain life and depth to our distant virtual mother sending it to us. So, in the name of preserving the path of these seams, always, I repeat, always sew from the seam out when sewing 2 pairs together. Of course, this does take more effort as you'll have to go back and sew the other side instead of just doing one straight stitch, but do it for the seam. Before sewing the body piece, we need to make sure to have our tail ready so we can sew it right in, and that is what I'm making here. I just cut a strip of fabric, folded it over, and then sewed down it to create this little opening that I will then stuff. You could also do piping, but either way, with the weight of this ball, the tail is not going to stand up straight. If you want to try something more rigid, like a wire or a stick, that would make it stand up like it does in-game, but I think it would make it a lot less cuddly. But if you think the tail looks dumb, you really don't have to do it. Or you could just sew like the ball of the tail to the body. And make sure when you are sewing the back that you do a couple times over the tail, just because that is a place that kids will probably pull on and it could fall off pretty easily. Do not sew all the way to the end of the curve. We gotta leave a little bit of open fabric at the end for the butt to sew onto. Now I'm sewing the 3rd pair on, which means there will be like this awkward place where 3 pieces of fabric meet. I suggest procrastinating that part until the very end. This will make it much easier since all the pieces going into that union are secured everywhere else where they need to be, so you know all the fabric there is meant to be there, and you can sew it down right. Here's that union spot I was talking about. With all the other parts done, it is way easier to see how far you should sew on these pieces. And I would just stick a pin on where you want to sew tail on the white part, and then go back and sew down the brown part to the white part. Also, with attaching the stomach to the back, it can be a little tricky. The curves don't match up perfectly, so I do recommend pinning the curve just right, but I was too lazy, so you can see me lining it up as I go. If you're skilled enough and everything has worked out perfectly, you should be able to just turn your piece and sew the butt to the stomach. When sewing this part, just stop when you reach the seam of the stomach. And any extra part from the butt will be sewn to the other side of the butt. Now, do it all again for the other side. Or, in my case, do it all again 10 more times for the 5 other dogs. One thing that's always pretty funny about doing a project is you really don't know if it's good until it's done. So here you are spending hours and hours on something, and you don't even know if you're gonna hate it in the end. Sometimes you're like, ooh, it's coming out pretty good. Sometimes you're like, oh, I don't know if this is gonna be good. And once you do that last side, you'll probably have holes in the butt and paws like this, which I told you to do, to procrastinate. And now is the time to line those pieces up and sew them up. For the back, you'll line up the 2 brown pieces, sew them all the way down. Then you're gonna sew across, so the brown and the white are sewn together all the way. Last I checked, this wasn't the headless mom's plushie. So yeah, we gotta make a head. So for 2 of the dogs, I sewed the front and back piece of the head together first, then sewed the right and left pairs together. And in the case of this dog, that's what I did. Then for the other 2 dogs, I sewed the fronts together, and then I sewed the backs together, and then I sewed those front and back pairs to each other. And I like this way a lot better. The tops of their heads came out with more roundness, but the ones where I sewed the back and front together first, they came out kind of flat a little bit on the top. And also be super cognizant of where those little L marks are on your pattern, because those are telling you which way is up and which way is to the front. There were a couple times where I either sewed them upside down or sewed the back where it should have been the front, so just be very aware of that. To connect the head and the body, I'm just sewing the front of the head to the chest part of the dog, and I'm doing so working from the seams out. Let's make this like a Thanksgiving turkey and stuff it. So dumb. And to stuff these dogs, I'm starting with a cup of these plastic beads, and I really like them. They give some heft to the dog, which is very comforting, and I'm making sure to focus the bulk of the beads towards the front and the back of the paws. Now, for the stuffing, I'm packing it in at a medium light density since I want these to be cuddle companions and I think they should be a little bit squishy. However, if I was making them for display, I would pack them as densely as I could so it holds its shape better. But like, it's your choice, whatever you like. AKA the built-in stress balls. Seeing that these are smaller pieces, I'm folding my fabric in fourths and then cutting them all at once. And if one does get messed up, then it's not going to be too much fabric to cut another one. And when cutting so many layers at once, especially with this fabric, which was super thick, I do recommend pinning the pattern into place so you don't have to worry so much if you're moving it too much, and you can just focus on trying to cut through all these layers. I should mention that on all the tails, I was using a slightly different pattern each time, trying to figure out the right way to do it. And finally, my last tail, which was Bedford, I did well. And that is the pattern I will include below. Just sew all the way around in a circle, but leave like a small opening so you can turn it inside out and also stuff it. And when it comes to stuffing, it's also your choice how firmly you want to stuff it. I think of these tails as like little stress balls, so like just pack it to a point where you think it feels good to kind of squeeze. To attach the tail, I'm just cutting off that excess fabric I had on there to make sure the seam didn't rip open, but make sure not to cut too close. And then I'm just doing this like loop stitch. For the ear, I'm just sewing all the way around it. And you may be thinking, Shermie, but how will you turn it inside out if you sew all the way around it? Well, have no fear. I actually thought ahead. So for the ear, I'm just making this little cut in the back of it, and that's how I'm gonna turn it inside out and stuff it. And be very careful not to slice through both layers. Also, if you're preparing a scavenger hunt for like a family activity or for a hidden pirate treasure, etc., I would highly recommend hiding a clue on one of the ears. You know, there's some fun puns you could use to make the clue leading up to it, like something about hearing and like a dog, like listen to the dog bark or something. I don't know. You can think on it more. We'll be lightly stitching up that slit because it's not going to be seen, so it'll be pretty easy to get into once someone rips the ear off. Although make sure the ear is easy to rip off, so don't sew it on too well. It's a pretty good place for a clue, just saying. But not too easy, you know? Expert level treasure hunting, but not too expert. So the goal when attaching the ears is to make them look like they're barely hanging on for dear life. So after spending great amounts of time deciding what position looks best, you're going to do a running stitch about an inch from the ear's seam, make it appear as if it's just boop, was barely stuck on there. This doggy won't be losing its head. For this part, I've removed almost all the fluffing from the head to just get some nice slack in there. And I'm going to be generous when folding over that seam allowance. Otherwise, you'll get some like giraffe neck action going on because there's just too much seam allowance there. And this is one of the few cases where I'm not sewing from the seam, because if one side is uneven, then I can just take the extra fabric into the other side, or I can let the seam out if there's not enough room to go around. So you're going to want to come in from the sides so if anything's a little bit off, you have that seam to play with and get them to line up in the end. You will be using a ladder stitch to sew it off, which is not what I'm doing here because I was uneducated swine 2 weeks ago. So please, don't be uneducated swine. Do a ladder stitch. At the end, you may get this vertical opening. For some reason, some of them did it and some of the others didn't, and just do your best to sew it shut with a ladder stitch. Now for our friends who traded ears for manes. Roary is a denim patchwork lion, and as such, his body will be just a little bit different from any of the others. You can choose to patchwork his body however you like, but I'm going to be following how they did it in the game. I'll have 4 pieces of denim on each side, and I'm also making sure to use different kinds and different sides of the denim, so it really gives that patchwork feel. After I sewed all the pieces together, I made sure that the bodies were about the same size and matched up, trimmed off any extra bit, and after you do all that, the body can be treated just like any other body. So for the head, the lions are done differently from the dogs. I also have their head pattern linked below. After cutting the 4 pieces of the head, I sewed the front 2 pieces together and the back 2 pieces together, But before sewing the front and back to each other, I had to make the manes. Roary has these triangle bits made out of my old dress, and Bedford has these round green pieces. And I am sewing one piece after the next, which is not only easier, but also keeps them tied together, which makes them a lot more manageable. Did that work? Manageable. You know, it's easier to manage. Anyway, when you're done sewing them, turn them inside out and stuff them with something white. For Roary, it should be stiff to help his mane stand up and go all the way to the base of the triangle. And for Bedford, I'm stuffing him with more fluff. I went ahead and ironed Roary's to make them nice and crisp, but I would not recommend doing that for Bedford's mane. Now to pin the pieces in place to make sure the spacing is all right. So I totally oopsied on the triangles for Roary and made them too small, but I didn't want to go back and cut more for my dress, so I'm just keeping them this size. But no worry, I corrected it in the pattern. They will be bigger. So once I pinned, I sewed them all down. Now, if you are some S-rank pro at this sewing thing, you might be able to get away with sewing the back on at the same time as the mane. Personally, though, I didn't think it was worth the risk and painful effort it would have been, so I'm going to do it later. Plus, doing 2 go-arounds will make the mane way more secure, and I get the feeling that kids might pull on it a little more than other places. So once I do that first go-around on the mane, sewing them all down, I'm going to pull on each little piece and make sure it got sewed nicely. Now that my mane is all secure, I put my top part on and I pinned that one down just because with all these layers I felt like it was going to be a hassle keeping everything lined up. And because I hate pins and hardly ever use them, I somehow managed to put them on the bottom side of the fabric with the heads facing the sewing foot. Warning, do not be a buffoon like me. Be smart. So to turn it inside out, I'm just going to seam rip along the seam that is on the back of the head. And this will also be the hole later we use to secure the head to the body. And I would be cautious doing a huge slit right away. I ripped open the seam as I sewed it on just to make sure I didn't go overboard with how much seam I opened. And then you just secure the head to the body like we did before. Instead of no faces, let's have some yes faces. Which I started by drawing the face on all my plushes first. Which, even though I know it's disappearing ink, it's still super nerve-wracking to scribble on the face of hours of work. But just take a deep breath and do it. Once you've drawn on all the features and they're looking pretty good, you can start to apply the face. We will begin with Puppers. First off, we need this muzzle piece as the backdrop to his nose and mouth. And I'm just doing a quick running stitch to hold it in place. With that done, it's time for the rest of the face. For the mouth, I just took some red fleece, folded it over, sewed along the fold, and that gave me a little bit of a crease. It's kind of hard to see, but it adds a little more depth. I have this little plastic nose which you stick through the fabric and secure from behind. Once you put the nose and eyes in, there's no going back, folks. This is definitely a case of measure twice and stab the hole only once situation. And I realized some of the supplies I used for the dogs, like these eyes, are a little hard to get in small quantities, which also means I have a lot of leftovers of some supplies, so I'll be selling kits on my Etsy for the plushies. It's linked down below. To finish this one, I just need to embroider the stitching on all of its seams. And just like the center seam, this stitching really helps the dog seem more homemade. As Pupper's face is much more professional than all the other ones, he needs like a little bit of something to take him down a notch. And here he is all done! Ain't he a cutie? Bedford! His face will also use plastic eyes and noses, so make sure you don't sew Bedford or Puppers up before doing their face because you gotta work from behind on them. And his face is a little bit wonky, so I'm placing his nose so it's off center, and I'm also making it a little bit crooked. And his left eye will be higher than his right eye. So make sure you use those crookedness to make him cute and special. For his whiskers, I'm making them like I did the tails, but instead I'm sewing off each end. I do recommend like double stitching those to make sure they don't burst. Then, to secure the whisker, I'm just hand stitching it down, and I recommend going back and forth a couple times just because this is something that might get pulled out and eventually fall off. With all 4 whiskers sewn on, this cutie is done! I love him so much. Dot! Or as I keep saying, Dottie in my mind, for some reason. So, Dot has an embroidered face, and when you zoom in on it in-game, you can tell there's little imperfections in it, which tells me that it was hand-done by our sweet mother, and therefore not done by a machine. So, when sewing mine, I tried to do a bunch of like weird zigzagging stuff, hoping it would give it that imperfect look. However, the same effect probably would have been achieved just by embroidering back and forth like a normal person and leaving small gaps here or there. But if you want to be crazy and follow this same technique as me and waste embroidery thread, go right ahead. Be a crazy lunatic. Zig back and forth. Pretending you know what you're doing. And that right there is our cute little Dot. Roary. For some reason, the only facial features we have for Roary are 2 bullseye's eyes. So I'm sewing the second ring of the bullseye directly onto the first, then I'm gonna sew the whole thing onto the body. I just thought that would be easier than sewing the first one, then the second one, while also on the body. Then I have this little white pupil I'm sewing on. It's made of felt. And I played around with the idea of having the eye lightly tethered so I could like move the eyes around and make different expressions kind of with them. But that wasn't working, so I just sewed it down in the middle like they did in the game. But I'll probably move them later for a more lively face instead of this kind of hollow face. And I might also add a nose or mouth one day. This denim keepsake is now all done, ready and flowing with memories. Pippa! In-game, Pippa's face appears to be some sort of transfer material. So I thought about doing an iron-on vinyl, but so far in life, every time I've tried to do vinyl, it's been a huge hot mess. So I'm just gonna sew them on and save myself the trouble and the wasted money. When sewing the blue part of the eye onto the black, I am doing this like loop stitch along the outside in hopes that it will help the blue not fray. I should also mention, when doing the noses and the mouths for the dogs, I did kind of try to work in a snout area where you can see like little peaks where the nose and mouth would go, so look out for those. With that, our little peppy Pippa is all done. Gertie! In-game, her face is embroidered on, so I decided to do the same, but less amateur-like. Hopefully. I've seen this kind of puff embroidery around lately, and I like it. I haven't been able to find a tutorial for it, so I'm just gonna wing it. I took this white fleece and cut it in the shape I wanted, and then I placed it on her face. Originally I was hoping to do like some big round begging eyes with the stars in them, but I couldn't draw them in a way that I was happy with. So instead I'm doing these pleased close eyes. After making a second copy of the first piece I cut, I laid it down on her face and started doing these wide stitches just to hold it in the exact position I wanted. With that done, I started doing a satin stitch over the whole thing. One thing I learned while doing this is to get the stitches precisely on the edge of each piece of fleece, because if you go too far it'll stick out, but if you go in too much it drags the fleece down and makes the shape smaller. So make sure you're very precise with where you're letting the needle come up and go down. And here is this adorableness all done. Gertie's definitely my favorite. And that is how I made all 6 of these guys. Aren't they so adorable? I love them so much. Mwah. Please consider liking, commenting, sharing, so YouTube will know to show this video when people are looking for it. As you can see, I probably don't need 6 of these dogs. I really don't have a place to display them, so I will be selling off 4 of them. So check out my Etsy down below for that. This channel is focused on Animal Crossing and crafting content, so if either of those interest you, you know what to do, so you can stick around. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful rest of your day.